April 11th, at that critical moment, based on emergency dispatch records, Martin McNeil made a desperate call to 911. By the time the ambulance finally reached the McNeil home, an agonizing 30 minutes after the initial emergency call, precious time had already slipped away. Paramedics rushed into the house, carrying the heavy weight of life-saving equipment. They quickly made their way to the bathroom, where they discovered Michelle McNeil lying unresponsive in the bathtub. Without delay, the medical team sprang into action. Every second counted, and every movement was executed with urgency and precision. The paramedics worked tirelessly, using every life-saving measure they knew, their focus unshaken, to revive Michelle and bring her back to life. Once at the hospital, the scene shifted from urgency to inevitability. Despite the relentless efforts of the emergency room staff, despite all procedures, all attempts, there was nothing more they could do. Michelle McNeil was officially pronounced dead on April 11, 2007. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Michelle Summers came into the world on January 15, 1957, in the peaceful community of Concord, California. Born into a warm, deeply faithful Mormon family, Michelle's early years were filled with love, discipline, and the powerful presence of spiritual values that shaped every aspect of her upbringing. Her parents, devout members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, believed in hard work, community service, and the importance of nurturing their children with compassion, respect, and strong moral guidance. The Summers home radiated warmth, a place where kindness, daily prayer, and a shared meal around the dinner table were not just routine but sacred rituals. From a young age, Michelle radiated promise. She was bright, driven, and immensely talented. At school, she stood out not only for her intelligence and academic achievement, but also for her elegance and natural charm. She played the violin with extraordinary grace, a talent that won her accolades in school orchestras and regional music events. She was also a spirited cheerleader, a positive force who uplifted those around her. Peers and teachers alike were drawn to her gentle energy, quiet confidence, and effortless beauty. As she grew into her teenage years, Michelle began to enter local beauty pageants, where she consistently impressed judges with her poise, eloquence, and modest confidence. In 1976, she was crowned Miss Concord, a title that seemed to encapsulate everything she was: graceful, articulate, compassionate, and radiant. The importance of faith remained central in Michelle's life well into adulthood. The Summers family was tightly woven into the fabric of their church community. Weekly services, youth group meetings, volunteer events, and Bible study gatherings were all part of their spiritual rhythm. It was during one such church-affiliated singles gathering that Michelle first encountered Martin McNeil, a young man who would alter the course of her life forever. Martin presented himself with striking polish, well-dressed, clean-cut, and brimming with self-assurance. There was something calculated about his presence, an intensity that was both magnetic and slightly enigmatic. Michelle, who had always been open-hearted and trusting, felt drawn to his charisma. Within weeks, the two began dating seriously. Friends noted that things moved quickly between them, perhaps too quickly, but Michelle was swept up in the whirlwind romance. Within a month, she and Martin were married in a quiet yet joyous ceremony attended by family and friends. To those looking in from the outside, it seemed like a perfect match. Two bright, attractive young people with shared religious beliefs and a seemingly aligned vision for the future. In the early years of marriage, Michelle poured her heart into building a happy home. She dreamed of having a large family, of nurturing her children the same way her own parents had nurtured her. And over the next several years, that dream came to life. Michelle and Martin welcomed 4 children into the world: Rachel, Vanessa, Alexis, and Damien. Each child was cherished deeply, and Michelle's world revolved around their needs, milestones, and joys. She managed their expansive, well-kept home with quiet pride. Every corner of the house reflected her touch, from the homemade meals that greeted the children after school to the carefully packed lunches and ironed Sunday clothes. Neighbors often remarked that she seemed to have it all together. She was elegant, but never showy, attentive yet never overbearing. As Michelle built a haven for their growing family, Martin immersed himself in his professional ambitions. He pursued not just one, but two prestigious fields, medicine and law. He earned degrees in both and eventually established himself as a licensed psychiatrist. He was bright, no doubt about that, and he knew it. He relished his credentials and was quick to share them, often reminding others of his achievements and elite education. Though admired by many for his apparent success, Martin's pride sometimes came across as arrogance. While Michelle's humility grounded their family, Martin's need for validation often made him appear distant or self-involved. As years passed, the McNeil family grew even larger. In an act that appeared noble and generous, Michelle and Martin decided to adopt 3 more girls. Now a mother of 7, Michelle continued to meet every responsibility with patience, strength, and grace. She attended every school performance, every parent-teacher conference, and every medical appointment. From dawn until long past dusk, Michelle's days were consumed by motherhood, caretaking, and ensuring that her family thrived. To outsiders, they looked like the embodiment of the American dream. A beautiful family, a stately home, accomplished parents, and children who were thriving. But beneath the surface, unsettling patterns had begun to emerge. Shadows that even Michelle, with all her grace and strength, could not completely ignore. Despite his profession, Martin McNeil's own mental stability was becoming increasingly erratic. While trained to support and heal others through psychological insight, he seemed unable or unwilling to confront his own emotional turbulence. He could be moody, controlling, and at times manipulative. In private moments, he would unleash intense mood swings that Michelle often absorbed without complaint. Over time, his unpredictability cast a long shadow over the home Michelle worked so hard to preserve. By the time Martin reached his 50s, a noticeable transformation began. One that was subtle at first, but quickly evolved into something that worried Michelle deeply. He became fixated on his appearance. He shed weight rapidly, started spending long hours at the gym, and took to tanning with an almost compulsive regularity. Michelle, ever observant, sensed that this wasn't merely about health. There was something else behind the change. Something unspoken, unsettling. Martin's absences from the home became more frequent. He claimed it was work. Patients, consultations, conferences. But Michelle's instincts told her otherwise. He seemed more distant, more secretive, and less connected to the family. Friends who visited remarked quietly about his growing aloofness, his emotional withdrawal. Eventually, Michelle confided in her daughter Alexis. She shared her concerns and admitted that she no longer fully trusted her husband. Together, Michelle and Alexis decided to look deeper. One night, driven by intuition and heartache, they accessed Martin's phone records. What they found chilled them. Repeated calls to the same unfamiliar number, often late at night. The name associated with the number was Gypsy Willis. Neither Michelle nor Alexis recognized the name, but the frequency of communication, especially at such odd hours, spoke volumes. Michelle decided to confront Martin directly. Calm but firm, she asked him to explain. He denied everything. There was no affair, he claimed. Gypsy was a professional contact, nothing more. He dismissed her suspicions and, in a particularly cruel twist, suggested that perhaps Michelle's concern stemmed from her own insecurities. He urged her to consider cosmetic surgery, implying that it might boost her confidence and perhaps even rekindle their connection. The comment was wounding. Michelle had never felt the need to alter her appearance to feel worthy. But now, after years of service and sacrifice, the seeds of doubt had been sown. But the moment she mentioned even the slightest interest, Martin seized on it with unnerving speed and intensity. What Michelle had imagined would be a long-term consideration, perhaps something she'd planned for later in the year, was suddenly being rushed into immediate reality. Martin pushed for the surgery to be scheduled right away, not in the summer as Michelle had hoped, but within days. The urgency in his tone felt unnatural. Spring break, he said, would offer the perfect timing. Alexis, their daughter who was then in medical school, would be home for just long enough to assist, and there would be no better opportunity. Michelle voiced her concerns. She wasn't ready. She needed more time to mentally prepare and consider all the risks involved. But Martin would not entertain delay. Before Michelle could solidify her hesitation or reconsider the idea altogether, Martin had already taken matters into his own hands. He booked the consultation, confirmed the surgeon, and fixed the surgery date, all without waiting for her full, unpressured consent. At the preoperative consultation, Michelle barely spoke. Martin dominated the room, speaking not as a concerned spouse, but as someone accustomed to being in charge. With a clinical detachment cloaked in confidence, he rattled off the procedures he believed she needed. A facelift was just the beginning. He requested additional work: a rhinoplasty to subtly reshape her nose, a blepharoplasty to lift her eyelids, and even adjustments to refine her chin and jawline. Michelle, already overwhelmed, found herself sinking into silence as the list expanded. The total time under anesthesia would exceed 9 hours, a lengthy and taxing ordeal for any patient, especially one undergoing multiple invasive procedure in a single session. The approval came swiftly. It likely helped that Martin was a licensed physician. He carried authority, and few questioned his judgment. On April 3, 2007, Michelle entered the operating room for what she believed would be the beginning of a new chapter, one of healing, rejuvenation, and possibly reconnection with her husband. The procedures were intense, and the aftermath was everything one might expect. But Michelle was prepared for that. What she was not prepared for were the medications that followed. Unusual in both type and combination, the post-operative regimen Martin insisted upon raised quiet red flags. He requested an array of 5 potent medications, including multiple painkillers and sleep aids, drugs that, when taken together, are rarely prescribed in tandem due to their risk of interactions. Martin rationalized the prescriptions by claiming Michelle had a low tolerance for pain and required stronger than average relief. He offered assurances that, as a physician himself, he would oversee her recovery personally and with care. Despite his promises, hospital staff recommended she remain under observation for an extra night. Michelle's blood pressure was elevated, and she described feeling unusually anxious and unwell. Eventually, the hospital released her, and Alexis, attentive and concerned, brought her mother home. But Martin quickly stepped in again. He reminded Alexis that he had cleared his schedule and would handle all aspects of Michelle's recovery. Though reluctant, Alexis allowed herself to step back, believing her father's medical background meant Michelle was in safe hands. The next morning, Alexis returned to the house. What she found left her shaken. Michelle, always the picture of composure and self-reliance, seemed dazed, fragile, and mentally clouded. Her speech was slow, her movements heavy. Deeply alarmed, Alexis confronted her father directly. Martin, in a calm yet dismissive tone, admitted he might have over-medicated Michelle slightly but brushed it off as nothing serious. He said she simply needed to rest. Alexis, however, was no longer just a concerned daughter. She was a medical student with growing clinical knowledge and instincts. Something didn't sit right. These symptoms weren't ordinary post-surgical fatigue. The medication combination, the dosage, the lack of visible improvement, it all pointed to a recovery process that was not only mishandled, but potentially dangerous. From that moment forward, Alexis took control. She collected the pill bottles, monitored each dosage, and stayed by her mother's side for the remainder of her spring break. She watched carefully, rarely leaving Michelle alone, hoping her presence would protect her mother. Still, the clock was ticking. Her spring break was drawing to a close, and she would soon have to return to school. On the final evening before her departure, Alexis shared a quiet, deeply intimate moment with her mother. Michelle was in the bathtub, her eyes still bandaged, her body weary. As Alexis gently washed her hair, Michelle spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. She confided something that chilled Alexis to her core. Michelle explained that Martin had been giving her pills she didn't recognize, medications she had not been told about. She admitted she could no longer tell what she was taking because of the bandages over her eyes. She asked Alexis to describe the shape and color of each pill so she could learn them by touch. It was a haunting moment, one of vulnerability, awareness, and fear. Then Michelle said something even more sobering. "If anything happens to me," she said with quiet finality, "make sure it wasn't your father." Alexis was stunned. The words hung in the air like a cold draft through a closed door. What did her mother mean? Was this just fear talking or a warning? Unfortunately, there was no time to explore it further. The following day, Alexis had to return to school. Still, she spoke with her mother that morning, April 11th, shortly before 9 a.m. Michelle sounded more alert than she had in days. Her voice was clear, her tone light. She told Alexis that Martin had been surprisingly gentle and kind since she had returned to school, more attentive than usual. It offered a glimmer of hope, and for a brief moment, Alexis allowed herself to believe that perhaps the worst had passed. That would be the last time they spoke. Later that morning, Martin reportedly had a scheduled commitment, a professional engagement at a medical trade event. He left the house and returned just before noon. What he found, according to his account, was silence. Michelle didn't respond when he called for her. The house was quiet, too quiet. After searching the main floor, he entered the bathroom. There, he discovered Michelle, unresponsive in the tub. In that moment, according to emergency call logs, Martin phoned 911. But rather than speaking with calm and clarity, the call was marked by agitation and hostility. He barked at the dispatcher, responded impatiently to routine questions, and abruptly ended the call without providing their full address. When dispatchers attempted to call back, he again responded with irritation and hung up a second time. On a third attempt, he finally gave an address, one that was incorrect. Whether it was an honest mistake or something more deliberate remains uncertain. When the ambulance finally arrived at the McNeil residence, 30 long minutes after the first emergency call, time had already begun slipping away. Paramedics rushed inside, their bags heavy with the tools of life-saving work, and found Michelle McNeil unresponsive in the bathtub. Without hesitation, the team began CPR, defibrillation, airway management. Each second critical, each motion precise. The paramedics worked with intensity and focus, performing every technique at their disposal, their goal singular: bring Michelle back. But while they fought quietly and professionally to restore a heartbeat, a troubling distraction grew louder behind them. Martin. From the moment they entered the scene, Martin's behavior had stood out. Not because of grief, but because of its tone. It was not sorrow that filled the air around him. It was something more unsettling. His shouting resumed the pattern established in the 911 call: aggressive, commanding, and emotionally erratic. Instead of comforting his wife or stepping aside in desperation, he barked questions no one had answers to. At times, he seemed to yell at Michelle herself, demanding a response she could no longer give. To the emergency responders, Martin's presence became an obstacle. While they had been trained to manage chaos, this brand of distress was more difficult. It wasn't confusion or panic, it was volatility. At first, some suspected it might be shock, a natural response to sudden trauma. But others sensed something different, something that didn't feel organic. His reactions appeared, to some, less like spontaneous anguish and more like theater. Loud, dramatic, but hollow. Almost as if a script was being followed, with each outburst perfectly timed to draw attention. While the team continued their efforts, Martin momentarily stepped out of the room. During that brief moment of quiet, he made a phone call to his daughter Alexis. The voice on the other end was the one that had worried about this exact outcome for days. The message Martin delivered was short, clipped, and disturbingly sterile. There was no panic in his tone, no tremble of emotion in his words. He didn't offer an explanation, just a fact. For Alexis, the chill in that call confirmed what she had feared. Her mother's earlier whisper now echoed louder than ever in her mind. "If anything happens to me, make sure it wasn't your father." Within moments, Alexis was racing to the airport, desperate to reach Utah. Back at the hospital, chaos gave way to inevitability. The emergency team tried everything. They pushed medications, administered repeated compressions, and checked vitals for any sign of return. 45 minutes passed. Michelle's heart never restarted. She was officially pronounced deceased on April 11th, 2007. Despite Martin's last-minute plea, reportedly offering paramedics $10,000 to continue efforts, there was nothing more that could be done. It was over. Michelle, a devoted mother of 7, a cherished sister, and a woman known for her warmth, poise, and quiet strength, was gone. The cause of death, according to the initial medical examiner's findings, was listed as natural. The report cited myocarditis, underlying cardiovascular disease, and high blood pressure as contributing factors. There were no signs noted of foul play. No investigation was opened. On paper, it seemed tragic, but ordinary. A post-operative complication that sadly led to the loss of a life. But to Michelle's inner circle, her children, her siblings, and especially Alexis, nothing about this outcome felt ordinary. Nothing about her final days seemed accidental. The family's grief was profound. Her children were shell-shocked. Her sisters and brothers were stunned. Michelle had been the heart of the family, a quiet leader, a nurturer. The idea that her life had ended so suddenly and without suspicion didn't sit right with any of them. For Alexis, who had witnessed the medication regimen firsthand, the conclusion was devastatingly simple. Her mother hadn't been taken by nature. She had been misled, manipulated, and possibly deliberately over-medicated. Even before Alexis boarded her flight, she was already thinking about evidence. She called her sister Rachel in urgency. Her request was specific and clear. Search the house. Michelle's medications had to be collected and documented. The exact pill counts mattered. She needed to determine what Michelle had been given, what had been taken, and whether the dosage aligned with any legitimate medical protocol. But by the time Rachel entered the house, the medications were gone. When she asked Martin where the prescriptions were, he responded with vague shrugs and wandering explanations. Maybe the police had taken them, he said. Perhaps the pills were misplaced during the hospital rush. He suggested, almost casually, that they might have been left in the garage or possibly thrown away. His answers shifted depending on who was asking. But then another detail surfaced. This time from Damien, Michelle's young son. Damien confessed to his sisters that Martin had instructed him to dispose of the medications entirely. Specifically, he was told to flush them all down the toilet. When asked why, Damien recalled Martin saying the sight of the bottles was too painful, that seeing them only deepened his sadness. But to Alexis, the timing felt far too convenient. And the motive suspect. Disposing of the medication not only eliminated critical evidence, but also cut off the family's only remaining path to understanding what Michelle had truly endured in her final days. And then, just days after the tragedy, Martin's behavior raised even more eyebrows. With stunning speed, he began planning the funeral. There was no long deliberation, no family meeting, no gentle coordination with Michelle's relatives. Within 3 days of her passing, he had arranged the service. But what disturbed Michelle's loved ones most was not the speed. It was the exclusion. Martin made it explicitly clear to Michelle's family they were not welcome. In a move that felt both cold and calculated, he told her siblings that if they attempted to attend the funeral, he would call the police. The threat was direct. The message, unmistakable. For Michelle's brothers and sisters, grieving, confused, and angry, the decision to stay away was agonizing. But they complied, hoping to avoid further distress for Michelle's children. What remained of the ceremony was somber, quiet, and controlled entirely by Martin. But one unfamiliar presence stood out. A young brunette woman, whose name no one recognized, attended the service. She sat quietly. She didn't introduce herself, nor did she approach the family. At the time, her presence raised only mild curiosity. Perhaps she was a friend of Martin's, maybe a co-worker. But in the days that followed, this unknown guest would take on a far greater and more disturbing significance. In the aftermath of the funeral, Martin made yet another swift decision. He announced that he would be bringing someone into the home to help with day-to-day care. With 4 daughters still living at home, Michelle's oldest daughter was ready to put her future on hold. She offered to temporarily pause her studies and return home to care for her younger siblings, especially the youngest girls who still desperately needed maternal guidance. But her offer was quickly rejected. Martin, unmoved by her gesture, declined without hesitation. He told her it wasn't necessary. "You have your own life," he said flatly. "You shouldn't sacrifice your career." Instead, he informed her that he had already found someone else to take on the role of caretaker. Someone who, he claimed, could provide the support the family needed. Then came the name, Gypsy. When Alexis and her sister Rachel heard it, their stomachs dropped. The same name had haunted them ever since their mother's quiet suspicions months earlier. Could it really be her? Gypsy Willis, the woman whose late-night phone calls to Martin had triggered so much unease in Michelle? The woman whose name had been attached to a pattern of secrecy? They asked Martin directly. He didn't deny it. Yes, he confirmed. It was that Gypsy. But he was quick to shut down any further speculation. There was no affair, he insisted. She was just helping out. A friend, nothing more. But within just 2 weeks of Michelle's burial, Gypsy Willis moved into the McNeil household. Not into the guest room. Not as a live-in helper. She became a central figure in the home, without explanation, without title. Yet she wasn't fulfilling any of the expected duties of a caretaker. She didn't cook. She didn't help with cleaning. She didn't engage meaningfully with the children. In fact, she largely kept to herself, unless she was by Martin's side, which she nearly always was. To the children, she didn't resemble a nanny or a guardian. She resembled a partner. The two behaved like a couple, often inseparable, with Gypsy showing affection toward Martin openly. She catered to him, watched over him, and even corrected the children on his behalf. It was as if the role Michelle once held had been quietly replaced, with alarming speed and eerie familiarity. By July of that same year, barely 3 months after Michelle's passing, Martin took Gypsy to meet her parents. It was a visit that stunned those who later learned about it. There, in front of her family, Martin openly professed his love. He spoke glowingly of Gypsy, declaring her the one true love of his life, something he boldly claimed he had never felt for Michelle. And before the trip ended, Martin proposed marriage. Alexis and Rachel were heartbroken, appalled. Their mother's memory was still vivid. Her voice, her laughter, her final words still etched into their minds. And yet, their father appeared to be moving on at lightning speed with someone who had long stood at the center of their suspicions. When Alexis tried to confront him about it, the fallout was swift and severe. Martin, no longer interested in hiding his hostility, told Alexis she was no longer welcome in the family home. Then he went a step further. He gathered the remaining children and made an announcement that would fracture the family further. Alexis, he declared, was no longer part of the family. He instructed his children not to speak to her again, not to acknowledge her, not even to answer her calls. But Alexis was not easily silenced. With Rachel's help, she launched a blog, a digital journal dedicated to sharing her mother's story, seeking the truth, and gathering public support. What started as a deeply personal space soon grew into something much more powerful. Messages began to pour in from strangers, some offering condolences, others sharing disturbing patterns. Most notably, women began reaching out. Women who claimed they had once been romantically involved with Martin McNeil during his marriage to Michelle. Though not direct proof of any wrongdoing, the growing accounts painted a portrait of a man whose double life stretched far beyond what his family had suspected. Emboldened by the momentum, Alexis and Rachel took everything they had to law enforcement. They didn't yet have physical evidence of foul play, but the web of deceit was growing hard to ignore. 2 detectives took particular interest. Quietly at first, they began to review Martin's background. The deeper they looked, the more inconsistencies and outright fabrications they uncovered. The man who had long introduced himself as Doctor. Martin McNeil turned out to have an origin story that was anything but honorable. To begin with, Martin had never completed high school, not in the traditional sense. When he applied to medical school, he used someone else's diploma. His entrance into the professional world had been built on falsehoods from the very beginning. And shortly after marrying Michelle, he had already faced criminal charges. Fraud. He had opened bank accounts using the name of a deceased person and written over $36,000 in bad checks. The items he purchased with that money bordered on the absurd. Extravagant jewelry, luxury furniture, dozens of pairs of socks and shoes, and even a year's worth of chocolate-covered cherries. He was eventually sentenced to 2 years in prison, but served only 180 days. Still, despite this stain on his record, he somehow became licensed as a physician. His military service raised additional concerns. While briefly enlisted, Martin had reported hearing voices. The condition led to a discharge, yet he continued collecting a veteran's pension, reportedly $3,000 per month, for decades, even while earning significant income as a practicing doctor. Then, in 2009, a stunning development pushed the investigation forward. Both Martin and Gypsy were arrested, not in connection with Michelle's death, but for a different crime entirely: identity theft. They had sent Giselle, one of the adopted McNeil daughters, back to her birth country under the guise of a short visit. They told her it would only be 2 months, but then they cut off contact. It was never a family trip. It was a scheme. Martin and Gypsy used Giselle's identity, her name, her social security number, to create a false persona: Jillian McNeil. This fictional daughter allowed Gypsy to apply for new financial accounts and loans in an effort to erase her debt and escape her poor credit history. The plan might have worked if investigators hadn't been quietly observing. Martin was arrested at the airport. Gypsy was detained later that same day at the McNeil residence. The charges were serious. The court found them both guilty. Martin was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Gypsy received a 2-year sentence. And for the first time in years, the illusion of invincibility surrounding Martin began to crack. With both now incarcerated, detectives turned their full attention to Michelle's death. They re-examined and requested a more comprehensive toxicology review. The results were troubling. Multiple prescription medications were discovered in Michelle's system, 4, possibly 5, all present in quantities that raised questions. From the very beginning, Martin McNeil insisted that he had done everything he could to save his wife. But when paramedics arrived at the McNeil residence, something didn't add up. As the medical team attempted resuscitation, they observed a significant amount of water gushing from lungs, far more than should have been present if proper life-saving measures had been administered at the time Martin claimed. In fact, trained responders knew that had real CPR been performed, particularly chest compressions, much of that water would have already been expelled. The inconsistencies continued to mount, but for years, the case remained frustratingly unresolved. The death had initially been ruled natural. There was no immediate criminal charge. Despite the growing suspicions from Michelle's daughters and the blog-driven campaign for justice launched by Alexis and Rachel, it seemed the system was slow to move. Then, in a stunning development, a major breakthrough arrived. In 2012, just 2 months after Martin had completed his prison sentence for identity theft, he was arrested again. This time, it wasn't for fraud. It wasn't for deception. It was for something far more serious: the murder of his wife, Michelle McNeil. The courtroom proceedings began in October 2013, drawing intense media attention and public interest. After weeks of testimony, the case was finally handed over to the jury. They deliberated for 11 hours, carefully weighing the evidence, the conflicting narratives, and the unsettling statements brought forward. Then, in November 2013, they returned to the courtroom with a decision. Martin McNeil was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was swift. He was ordered to serve life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. On April 6, 2017, just over 2 years into his life sentence, Martin was found unresponsive near the prison's greenhouse. In the months following his passing, legal documents emerged that revealed a change in his will, one made after Michelle's death. In that rewritten document, each of his children had been allocated exactly $1, just a symbolic amount, nothing more. The rest of his estate, everything of value, had been left to Gypsy Willis.